Everyone, Zach here. Today I'm going to walk through a example using Ansible to fulfill a ServiceNow VMware guest order. So it's a pretty common IT operation to have, people within your organization request a new VM. How organizations do that varies quite a lot, to be honest. But I think a pretty common workflow is to have some sort of ITSM, in this case ServiceNow, where a user can go in and fill out a form, and then whether there be an approval or some sort of ticket routing to generally a member of your infrastructure team who picks it up and goes out and fulfills it for you, right? Whether that be provisioning a VM on the cloud in a tool like VMware or something similar. What I want to do is show how we can automate this with Ansible and actually go from ServiceNow to VM provisioned to entry in your CMDB, as well as kind of voice over some of the places where you could augment this even further. Scroll down here. The first two sections are going to be around, or the first section here where I have some links. This is going to be around setting up the actual ServiceNow to AAP integration. I didn't add that part to this blog because there are some really good resources out there for you to do that as well. The first one is going to be using this REST message. So it's basically going into ServiceNow and using some of the native functionality to set up a connection to Ansible controller. And then you build out REST messages, which can be specific things like a post to the launch job template endpoint. And then you can variabilize it as well, so that when a workflow calls that REST message, you can pass in parameters. So that's one option, and we use that way to kind of customize the extra vars we send over to the job template. The other option is Ansible Spoke, which is a paid component from the ServiceNow marketplace, but it does simplify the integration a little bit. A very similar process in the end, right? You're still making a post to the AP controller. It just looks a little bit different. That's going to be the version I use in the example today, but there's a lot of good, like both of these links I have here are pretty comprehensive. And once you get that set up, you can move on to one of the next two sections, right? So the first one goes over how to configure the flow if you're using Ansible Spoke, and then the second one is how to create the workflow if you're using REST message. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to go ahead and kick off the VMware guest provisioning. So here's the form that I have created for my VMware guest. If you've ever not created a form, just go to the catalog builder. It's pretty straightforward. You add fields and then you give the fields a variable, and I'll connect what that variable looks like. But I've got all this information here, so the request is for me. I'll give it a VM name, so I'll just say snow demo, or let's say snow VMware demo 1. And then I have a data center, which I could have a drop down. I only have one in my demo environment. Same thing with folder. If you scroll down, I have some options for some specs I can choose from, a couple different OSs I could pick, and then I have hard coded. These could also be text entries, right? But trying to control what input is there, and memory, and then disk as well. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to allow for someone to put in a public key. So I'll go ahead and put my public key in there so that I can SSH to the box when it is provisioned. So I'm going to go ahead and order that. And in the meantime, I want to go ahead and show really quickly what that catalog builder looks like, just to give you an idea in case you've never done that before. So I'll go to catalog builder, and I'm going to click on my VMware guest catalog item. Let me click edit just to give you a view of what it looks like. So you'll get this view here where you have a few different tabs. The beginning is more just details about the order itself. The important piece is the questions. So you can add questions, you can add question sets, right? So that was my location and my specs. That just kind of formats the form a bit. But if I click on one of these, and I click on the three dots here, this is how you configure the question itself. And you'll have different question types and subtypes. The important piece here is that name, right? So this name is actually what's going to be passed through as a variable to the flow. So if I X out of this, right, I've set up variable names for each of the inputs, data center, folder, and then my various specs. So if I go now to Flow Designer, the flow is what actually ends up running when I submitted that order. So I've got it connected to this VMware guest provision flow. And the flow is pretty simple, right? I've just got the trigger being service catalog. And then I've got one action. My action is launch job template. This action is available via the Ansible spoke, right? So this is, again, comes back to having the Ansible spoke installed in your ServiceNow environment. Several different actions you can choose from. In our case, I'm launching the job template, but you can do other things with the controller API. I then just have the job template ID, which if I go into controller and show you in a bit, I'll show you in the URL where you can see the job template ID. And the most important part here is this extra arguments. And I did a scripted version. If I click on it, it's actually pretty gross. But I formatted it in the blog post so it's a little bit clearer to see what I'm doing here. But effectively, I'm just returning a JSON payload. And I'm building it with the object that comes into the flow. So the flow designer data, the trigger, and then for me, it's going to be a request item. And then it's basically that glide record, if you're familiar with ServiceNow. It's the glide record body. So you've got variables. So these are the different options I configured, and you see that VMware guest names. That was important again. I showed that when I was setting up the catalog item. Go all the way to the end. There's a few generic items I use as well. So the request item.sysid and the request item.number. So those are things that are actually just generic as a part of any request item that gets ordered. So let's go over to Ansible Automation Platform, and you'll see that one. Let's go ahead and running. So let me show the job template itself. Search for VMware. So here's my job template. I'm pointing at the playbook, which is the source code link for the blog post. So if you want to actually see the playbook, go ahead and go there, and you can check it out. I've got a few credentials here, so I'll explain what each of them are. The first one here is my machine credential. So this is my SSH key that matches the public key that I put into ServiceNow when I ordered the VM. I've got an additional one called VMware Bastion. So that's specific to my setup. You may not need to do that, but when I spin up these guest VMs, they're in a subnet, and I do have a Bastion host. So I'm using that credential to actually proxy my SSH connection through the Bastion host. And I'll have a subsequent blog post to talk about how to do that as well. But that's just a limitation of my environment right now. The third one is my actual VMware credential, right? So the ability to provision a guest in VMware. That's my credential to do that. And then the fourth one is my ServiceNow credential. So at the end of this playbook, I'm going to actually have some integration with ServiceNow back, and I'll show that. So that's my credential there for connecting back. And there's no other thing to really show here. Got my execution environment, of course, as it's my default EE that I build, which it has the VMware collections and it has the ServiceNow collections. That's going to be important. And then from the inventories perspective, I really run the playbook on localhost, and once I create the VM guest, I actually add it to the in-memory inventory to connect to it because it's all in one playbook. But I could also set up that cloud inventory, like sync my VMware instances, or since I'm adding it to CMDB, I could sync from ServiceNow as well. So let me hop back over to the blog post really quickly just to connect some of the things that were happening. So this is the formatted part of the spoke that was a little bit gross when I showed it in the UI. Just to give you a better idea of what I'm really building here, it's effectively that JSON payload that acts as the extra variables that we're going to pass through. Scroll down, the playbook that actually runs here, it's just one module or one task, and I'm calling that VMware guest, and these are all those variables that I'm passing through from the service catalog item that I've configured. One of the important pieces here is this advanced settings. So this actually gives you a lot of power. So this is going to be a cloud init template, and you can add as much information as you want. You can look in the source code repository at that user data Jinja. Mine's pretty simple. I'm just creating that Ansible user and adding my public key as an authorized key. And then I'm setting things like the FQDN and the host name. But you can do quite a lot with Cloud Init. So, I have the document linked at the bottom of this post for Cloud Init and all the things you can do. So whatever you would have put into your Jinja template would actually get rendered and then encoded and added as the Cloud Init script for the VM that gets provisioned. And then I have this fun bonus play here. Originally I wasn't going to do this, but I actually I really wanted to close the loop. So the second play is going to use an in-memory inventory host, which if you look at the source code, you'll see there's an additional task in the first play. Um, and what it does is it's actually going to connect to the new host. So you see my hosts are pointing at new guest. It's going to connect to it, but with gather facts. So I set gather facts to true to get some information. And then the next tasks are actually I'm delegating to localhost, but that's because I'm just hitting the ServiceNow API. But I'm using information that I got by actually connecting with gather facts. So all these Ansible underscore variables are coming from me connecting to the host and getting information. So I first create the configuration item for the new VM. And then the second piece is I link the requested item, so that order I just made, to the configuration item. And that way when I go into ServiceNow and I look at the requested item, it'll actually have the configuration item that I just created. So before I let you go, we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at kind of the results of what the order created, but I do want to give you some thoughts as far as what can you do beyond what I just showed. So ServiceNow is really powerful, right? I could have used it for data input validation as well on the form itself. Mine was pretty basic. I used like static select lists, but if you wanted to have more dynamic, right, you could have the select list tied up to a table, or you could have free text but then have validation. You can also add approval workflows, right? So you could have thresholds that, if someone's requesting, 16 CPUs or some crazy amount of memory, you could have an approval workflow kick in before it actually gets provisioned. And then notifications as well, right? Ansible also has the ability to do notifications, but depending on where you want those to happen, you could do it in ServiceNow as well. The other thing is, this second point here, it's kind of what the bonus play is, but what I'm saying is you could augment that playbook, right, to gather information, and then you could add it to, various inventories. In this case, I'm adding it to CMDB, and then I updated the ServiceNow record with that link to the CMDB item. And the third piece, I kind of touched on it, but use the power of cloud in it, right? You can go ahead and spin up the guest, and then you can do quite a bit of configuration. You can also do it with Ansible, so it's really where you're comfortable and where you want that to happen. Because once you spin it up, you can connect it with Ansible, right? And you can do some of your post-provisioning configuration. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the results of our order are. All right, so our provisioning playbook ended. If we scroll down here, a lot of information, but it looks like we got all the way to provisioning that guest, connecting to the host itself, getting some information, Ansible facts, and then updating ServiceNow. So let's look at vSphere. We can see I've got my Snow VMware Demo 1. And then if I go back to my order here in ServiceNow and click on it, you'll see that we've got a linked configuration item. So I click on the info there. Not too much info, but we got our CPUs that we order, a memory, and any other information that you would want to post to that configuration item would be there as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to drop a comment. And then keep an eye out for some follow-up posts, specifically talking about how to use a jump host to connect to a VM, that's in a more private network. Thanks.